This is the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour podcast. Kane and Olgun with you as we are every single Tuesday. And we've been building up to this moment, Olgun. The final round of the NBL regular season is here, and perhaps we have the top six locked in. I would say probably yes, but we're going to go through the games that we have remaining. We're going to talk about some of the teams, good and bad, we saw across the weekend, whether it's Melbourne, Adelaide, Southeast Melbourne, Sydney as well. We're going to get into all those. And, of course, Perth, a big weekend for them, and some fascinating lineup stuff we saw there from John Riley. But I am a little more dressed up than I normally would be. We've got Nothing But Net. I've got the logo on this side, just behind me here. And there's been a bit going on at ESPN over the last few days. I've just seen people scurrying around. They're on their phones. Shams is in the building, just broken the biggest trade in the history of the NBA. So he's got to be feeling good right now. Lots going on this week in basketball.
So I was at the Kings Wildcats game in Sydney at Kudos Bank Arena. There's about 3 minutes left in the fourth quarter when I got the notification from Shams. And I looked at it and I immediately just sort of looked around to see if anybody else is like in as much shock as I am. And so I sort of made a beeline down to Chris Pongrass. He used to work in an NBA front office. Chris, could you check your phone, please? Looks at his phone. He also is in like a state of shock. I get a call from someone who's in the building. It's like, hey, is this real? So I texted Windhorst, I texted Bontemps. I'm like, guys, is this like did Shams get hacked? Like, it's his account. So the fact that, and then for the rest of the game, the last 3 minutes, and then the 20 minutes after that, no one cared about the result of that NBL game. Everyone's coming up to me saying like, oh, like, do the Lakers have a big man? Like, who are they going to start at the fight? Like, that's like the focus of the entire basketball world immediately shifted to that trade and what's going to happen beyond that. So it was really, really fun, exciting thing to sort of be a part of, be around basketball people when that trade went down.
And here's the thing for any potential hackers out there. Shams has trumped you, because even if you wanted to try and hack his account, there's no way that you could make up a trade that is more unbelievable in the future. So now Shams has won. He's won because he's broken this trade. No one believed it's true. It was actually true. So cool for him.
Nico Harrison ruined it for all hackers out there.
Yeah, insane stuff. We don't need to get into that. There's plenty of content you can consume when it comes to that trade. But it was interesting how this did go around the world. It was a little after midnight over here. Obviously, in the afternoon, you're covering that game. And I didn't know where I was going to start. But we will get to the Sydney Kings first, after we just take a quick look at where we stand now. And you shook your head, and I think you're very rightly so, when I said the top six might be locked in. And sometimes, as you know, Olgun, and you often say this, I'm not that often wrong, but but the Adelaide 36ers, as my 2 seed last week, all I needed them was to show just a little bit over the weekend. Instead, they lost 2 games and looked pretty awful in the process of doing it. So it looks like they're just going to, by default, end up in this top 6. I know technically Tassie and Brisbane could get there, but there's 4% between where Adelaide's at and where those two teams are. You'd be talking about Adelaide losing by 40 and Tassie winning by 40, that type of stuff. Like it's not really realistic that that's going to be the case. So it looks like Adelaide is going to be there. And then from there on out, the positions in between are where it gets interesting. Illawarra are the only team that has 2 games this weekend. They travel to New Zealand and then they head to Sydney. So that could be an interesting wrinkle for them as they look to lock in top spot. I find it hard to believe that Illawarra could drop out of that top two, even if they lose both games, again, because of the percentage at 110% there. So there could be still some shuffling. But what it does mean is that Perth really is in the box seat to finish third here and ultimately have a home playing game. And then I wake up this morning and see that playing game might not be at RAC Arena. Please fill us in on where this is at, because I don't know if my mind is going crazy. It doesn't feel like this is the first time that something similar has happened with arena availability around the postseason, but it's unfathomable that this could happen in a league that bills itself as professional as this. You've got to clear it out, and there's no way that this can possibly happen, right?
This is so a bunch of people are to blame, and I use the word blame in air quotes. A lot of people, this is the result of a lot of people. Mine, it's Kylie Minogue deciding to go on this tour around Australia. And this isn't just causing an issue in Perth. There are venue availabilities across the league that are a little bit iffy right now. So we should probably keep an eye on across the league on if venues are going to be available for playing games and things like that. But Kylie Minogue has booked out the RAC Arena for that entire week. And so if a playing game is going to be played there, there's a very good chance that at least one playing game will be played was supposed to have been played at RAC Arena, will be played in Perth. Then she's got it booked out. There's also, it's to blame the Perth Wildcats. They should have booked this ages ago. This should have been on their calendar, booked in months and months and months ago, as in over 12 months ago. So they're partly to blame as well. I understand and appreciate Mark Arena going at RAC Arena because this obviously affects them in a significant way. If they have to play at the Perth High Performance Centre, that's a 4,000-seat arena compared to the 13,500 they can get at RAC Arena. I don't know how it'll go down with the owner of the Perth Wildcats sort of throwing a bunch of vitriol out at one of their biggest stakeholders. I don't know if that'll sit well with one of their biggest stakeholders. So that's something that Mark Arena, as a new owner, might have to tiptoe around, but he's coming out. There's a lot of like Mark Cuban, Elon Musk to him, where there's like no care for the stakeholders around him. And it's purely just, I've come in and bought this thing and I'm going to go full steam ahead and trying to protect it and do as much as I can with it. But it does look like right now that they're probably not, the Perth Wildcats probably won't be able to play at RAC Arena for this playing game. And I don't know if that's the difference between a win and a loss, but it could be the difference between 10 some odd thousand people being able to watch Bryce Cotton play basketball in Perth for the last time, potentially. And it could have some impact on them. They are one of the best home crowds in the league. So that is a significant blow for that team, assuming they're not able to sort something out, which I doubt they will be.
Yeah, very interesting to see how this plays out. And that's a massive blow. You got your whole season riding on, getting into this spot, getting a home game, and then you're playing in front of a third of the fans in a building that is unfamiliar to this team. I believe I read in the statement they haven't played there for over a decade. So, this is just really not an ideal scenario. The other thing is we have seen alternate venues used. Is it ready for an NBL playoff game from all the aspects of bringing in the fans, bringing in everything you need to have a game there, the broadcasting, all that kind of stuff? So this would be a semi-disaster if they weren't able to play there. And I'm sure Perth Wildcats fans would be absolutely fuming about this. We've seen the crowds over the last few games, 13,000+ almost every single game on repeat. So this would feel not fair for the Perth Wildcats. And I don't know enough about the background to cast any blame, but it certainly caught my attention this morning. If there is a team that could be in the mix to potentially move up into that spot, you've got Southeast Melbourne and Sydney both on 16 wins. There's a pretty tight percentage gap between all these teams, so everyone could potentially shift and swap here. I already mentioned the Illawarra Hawks play in New Zealand, and they come back and they play the Sydney Kings. So let's talk about the Sydney Kings. You mentioned that game you were at, and I would say that a bunch of the fans, if they're Sydney Kings fans in that stadium, probably were looking for something to distract them, because I know the final in this game was 104-97. It didn't feel that close at all. And we've said this before. We discussed it last week. Sydney now 5-11 against teams in the top six, 11-1 against teams outside the top six. They're constantly behind on the scoreboard in the first half. And in a game that they should have been desperate to make a statement, to get a win, to try and get that home game themselves, this was honestly a pretty listless performance. There was really nothing inspiring about the way they played against the Perth team that played a couple of days earlier.
And it's particularly scary because if this is a team that right now is in fifth, there is a real potential they'll have to play two playing games, or a playing game and playing qualifier, to get into the playoffs. If that's the case, then if this is the sort of performance they put up in, not a must win, but a win that would have meant a lot for this team when it comes to the standings. And this is what they put forward, and add that on to the inconsistency throughout the season, the fact that they do fall behind in a lot of games. The idea of seeing this team can win two playing games in a row just feels almost impossible, right? If they're not going to be able to put first halves together, and if Jalen Adams can't stay on the floor, and if they're going to be so inconsistent on both ends on the floor, then can you see them winning two must-win, do-or-die, win-or-go-home games? It's very difficult to see that, especially against the teams who they would potentially be playing, which would be the Adelaide 36ers, who are a team that have had their number the last few games, especially in Sydney. And then it could be the Perth Wildcats, who have also had Sydney's number over the last few games they've played. And the Southeast Melbourne Phoenix, who the Sydney Kings have beat, but the Phoenix have looked somewhat comfortable against the Kings. So they don't give me confidence There are individuals on that team that I trust in a playoff environment. I trust Xavier Cooks, right? There's this reason historically to trust Brian Goorjian, but the way they put these performances together, they haven't strung 4 quarters together. I don't know when. Maybe that game in the feed in Southeast Melbourne, maybe that was on, but not even, because they let a huge lead slip. So they just don't give you confidence that they'll enter a playing environment and be sort of, I don't know, that they'll be ready to be able to put performances together.
No, and this was my argument last week, and we've all seen the talent. This has been a Sydney team that it probably got to halfway through the season before we started going back and forth on, all right, when are you actually going to show up? When are you going to turn it around? When are you going to give us a stretch of basketball where we all sit back and go, okay, the Kings have arrived. We see the talent. Now you're starting to get settled from a rotation standpoint, from a starting lineup standpoint. We just haven't seen that all season long. You've had the Cam Oliver stuff going on. And even when they have had big wins, they've had some comeback wins. It feels like almost every single game they're in a battle where it seems like they're flat, seems like they're not prepared to play, seems like guys are not invested in the game to the level that an opposition team is to start the game. And I heard a little bit on the broadcast about, well, they've had 8 days off. Look, you can't have everything. If you were playing your second game like the Perth Wildcats were, including travel, then you would be saying that, well, maybe they're a little fatigued because they've had to travel. Like, there's always an excuse for why they don't show up to start games. But this has been constant. And the one thing that was glaring in this game, and Brian Goorjian was pretty clear about wanting another guard on this roster, and you can see why, because even over the last 6 weeks where they have been competitive, they've lost some close games, Jalen Adams has averaged over 30 points per game. He's had a couple of 40-point games. Without him, the ability to score from the guard position is almost zero. He only had 1 point in this game, 14 minutes. He was in foul trouble to start the game. And we also know the fact that he's been carrying a back injury. And for the most part, I would say this has been a pretty tough effort from Jalen Adams, who doesn't look close to healthy. But if he's not able to completely dominate games, they just don't seem like they got enough of the guard position.
It was interesting though, because offensively, things seem to be generally fine. They got good production out of Cam Oliver, out of Alex Tui. This team, it's annoying that they've gone up to this point in the season and they still don't know how to utilize Xavier Cooks. They don't know how to maximize what he brings to the table. He looks like a bystander out there. He looks like someone who's just setting screens, handing the ball off, and then that's it. Like, he's just not a central part of this offense, which I think he has to be. But yeah, not having John Adams for a significant portion of that game is not helpful. And the other annoying part of this game was, we've heard all season long Brian Goorjian having issues with some of the scheduling, the amount of Friday, Sunday games they've had to play, or Thursday, Saturday, the quick turnarounds. Well, the Perth Wildcats played a game at 9:30 Australian Eastern Daylight Time in Perth, and then they had to travel to Sydney for what I think is maybe the quickest turnaround in the NBL, which is a 9:30 p.m. on a Friday into a 2:30 p.m. Arvo game in Sydney on a Sunday. And the Perth Wildcats came out. They looked like the team that had that extra level of explosiveness and electricity, and they were the team that had 20-plus O boards. And then it was fitting that the last possession of the game was, I think, 3 straight O boards for the Perth Wildcats. They were the team that were playing with a little bit more rigor. They were the ones who were crashing the board. So you can't spend an entire season having issue with the schedule that you've had to have so many quick turnarounds, and then play a team that's had that quick turnaround, and you've had this substantial break, and you can't get over the line against them because of what I think everyone would consider an effort thing in crashing the glass. So again, just a lot of red flags for the Sydney Kings. We've spoken about the fact that we think they should be fine, right? Their defense has held up really, really well all season long, and I think everyone had this sort of romantic view of it, that they're going to get to the playoffs and Cam Oliver's all of a sudden going to average 18 or 10, and Bulk Wall's going to find his footing, and they're going to get the peak Alex Tui for every game, and Xavier Cooks is going to average a triple-double, and Jalen Adams is going to drop 30 pieces. But the fear is that they've got to get there. And when you have singular games like the play-ins, it makes it very tough to see this team having confidence in this team.
Yeah, but the last point you made is perhaps why we are set up to have such an insane playing tournament here, because the teams that are going to be in there, whether it's Perth, who can have a stinker like they did the week before against Cairns, or Southeast Melbourne that is without arguably their best player, a former NBL, All-NBL first-team guy, and Derek Walton. We'll see if he comes back. It seems like he continues to be positive about that possibility. You've got the Adelaide 36ers that one day can look like the best player, best team in the league, and then the next week they look like they're not only about to fight fans, but they're about to fight themselves, and they're arguing again on the bench. And then you've got this Sydney Kings team. So I think the reason why I've pretty much consistently just said Illawarra. I know they've had some bad losses as well, but I trust that Illawarra can do it not for one game, but I trust that they can do it for 7 games. And Sydney could come in and win a playing game. But based on the 28 games that we've seen so far this season, based on how often they are behind, at this point of the year, why would you believe that they're all of a sudden going to lock in the postseason and win 2 playing games, potentially, and then go through and win a best-of-3 series and a best-of-5 series, potentially up to 7, 8, 9 games of postseason basketball against the best teams in the league who they haven't beat outside of Southeast Melbourne till September. So I am questioning the Sydney Kings, but I'm also questioning every single other team that is in this playing tournament. And that's why I think we could be about to see some of the most entertaining, dramatic playoff games that we've seen in a very, very long time, because there is no possible way that you can predict what you're about to see.
Look, yeah, whoever makes the 4, I think once that's settled, it's almost open season. I don't think the Illawarra Hawks have had a level of consistency that no other team has had. Yes, they've had slip-ups, but they've been, for the most part, the most consistent team, especially because their wins, I think, have been so substantial that you give them some credit for that. And I think Melbourne United, especially with their ability to lock in defensively, they did it at the start, the first third of the season. They've done it this last third of the season. They had a blip in the middle, but this last third of the season, I think they've been great, especially defensively. So they're a team that, I look at these teams, I think, all right, who do I trust? I trust Delhi and Shilly and Chris Golding and Dean Vickerman. The Illawarra Hawks, I trust Sam Frolic. I trust Tyler Harvey in those environments. When it comes to the Sydney Kings, I trust Xavier Cooks. And I trust, to an extent, I trust Jalen Adams in those big-time environments. And the Perth Wildcats, I trust Bryce Cotton. So there are individuals. There are individual people within these teams that I trust when it comes to those games, which makes me think that when the top 4 is settled, there's no favorite at that point. Anyone can beat anyone, and I think that's going to be really fun. But that's why I will say this upcoming game between Sydney Kings and the Illawarra Hawks is, again, it's in Wollongong. I don't want to say it's a must-win. I don't know. It's not do or die for the Sydney Kings, but it's as close to it as it's going to get, because the Sydney Kings need to keep their opportunity alive to be that 3rd seed. And so in order to do that, they need to beat the Illawarra Hawks. Then they would need, ideally, the Adelaide 36ers to beat the Perth Wildcats. But if the Kings can beat 3rd or 4th, if they can keep it to 1 playing game, right, then it's just beating the Illawarra Hawks, and then they would need Melbourne United to beat the Southeast Melbourne Phoenix. Now, obviously, United has every reason to beat the Phoenix. They want to remain in 2nd spot. And so that's the dream for the Sydney Kings. If they can beat Illawarra, which is a very tough task, they haven't done it before, it's in Wollongong, and they would need Melbourne United to beat the Southeast Melbourne Phoenix. That would lock in a top 4 spot for the Sydney Kings. And that would just feel, if I worked with the Sydney Kings, I would just feel a weight off my shoulders, knowing that we just need 1 game to get into the playoffs, and I can trust my team to play a 1-do-or-die game, because you're hoping that the inconsistency, the roller coaster, you're hoping that it's at its peak when you get to that game. But the fear is that you play 1 playing game, you're at your peak, and then the next game you're at that valley again, and you're knocked out of it, and you don't make the playoffs at all. So that's the dream for the Sydney Kings this week.
I'm telling you, the other part of that is, I don't care what we just saw on the weekend. They don't want any part of Adelaide in that first playing game just to get to the second game. Nobody does. I'm not sure they would feel that confident against Perth, and Southeast Melbourne's been so consistent here for a while, but the Kings have beaten Southeast Melbourne 3 times. They don't want Adelaide. They do not want Adelaide, a team that has gone into that building in Sydney and blown them out not too long ago. So, yeah, it's going to be a fascinating last week. I was thinking a lot about imports and how teams pick their imports and what teams might look to do in the offseason. And I started thinking about this because of the Tassie-Melbourne game, where you're looking at a Tassie team where there's going to be conversations about what does this team look like next season. I know it hasn't been Milton Doyle's best season. He is getting older. there is a reliability that they could bring him back and at least know what the best looks like. But I don't think a thing that Tassie can afford to do in the future, and this is why when they initially signed Ian Hummer, okay, it was some insurance, Will Magnay went down, but I don't think you can afford to have 2 imports coming off the bench. And where you choose your imports based around your local players is so important. And I don't really want to get into a conversation about Tassie, but the reason I bring that up is because I was thinking about that. And then I was watching Southeast Melbourne play against Adelaide just after I watched that Sydney Kings game. And I was thinking to myself, if the Sydney Kings had Geordie Hunter on their roster instead of Cam Oliver, would they be a significantly greater title chance? And I think the answer is yes.
So do I. I think if the Sydney Kings had Geordie Hunter, they were about to start strongly recruiting Isaac Humphries. If they had Isaac Humphries instead, just like a more traditional big presence, I feel like that would have been preferable. You get the thinking in signing Cam Oliver, the floor spacing theoretically with Xavier Cooks. I think that's something that they were looking at. But yeah, if they had like a traditional big, especially because they don't have that across the roster. Their backup big man is currently injured. It's Kelly Leaupepe. He's also 6'6", 6'5", maybe. So they don't have that position. And when it comes to singular matchups, what happens if they have to play the Adelaide 36ers in a playing game? That was they're a very unique matchup because Adelaide 36ers play 2 bigs and the Sydney Kings have half a big in Cam Oliver. So it's when you get into those sorts of matchups, it's just good to have insurance at every position. And I don't think the Kings have that at the big spot.
It is interesting, and I understand as well why they picked up Lawrence. So this is after seeing a year of basketball. So you make the decision at the time, and I think everyone could justify bringing in a guy like Cam Oliver. We've seen him dominate the league before. But Geordie Hunter has been a guy that, I've been curious. What happens if it looks like if he's starting? What happens if he plays 23 to 25 minutes instead of 15 off the bench? And I know he's had some injury history over the last few years as well. But he's always been a really solid guy. And their numbers don't jump off the page, 10 points, 7 rebounds, getting around 3 offensive rebounds per game. But he's so important for that Phoenix team, who, funnily enough, don't really have a backup big man either. So it kind of would have been a similar situation. And it's easy to look at it now. But how did the Phoenix get Geordie Hunter? How did that all go down? Because I'm looking at the Kings and if you had Geordie Hunter, who you've had for years, he's a champion on your roster, and then you actually had more scoring punch at the guard position, the roster would just immediately look so much better balanced.
Yeah, there are a lot of different factors that went into it. Firstly, Geordie wanted, and he initially had, an Asia out in his contract. And that wasn't something the Sydney Kings were willing to agree on. Because the overwhelming smoke was that there were teams around Japan who were interested in Geordie. There was an overwhelming chance that he would have used that out and gone to Asia in some capacity. So there was a fear that if you lean into Geordie Hunter and you commit to that, he was probably going to be out of there anyway. Now, Geordie Hunter has since removed that Asia out, renegotiated that contract for a substantial amount of money. I don't think that's an amount of money that the Sydney Kings are able to pay. And so Geordie sort of got priced out of Sydney, first by the out and then by the amount of money he ended up getting from that renegotiation. Then there's also the question of Geordie Hunter and Xavier Cooks as a duo. Does that work? Xavier Cooks, someone who is a non-shooter and sort of creates from the 4 spot. Do you need someone who's a bit more complimentary as a shooter, does other things than what Geordie Hunter does, who I think is an elite role guy, as in like a guy who can screen and roll? Is that the ideal fit next to Xavier Cooks? I'm not sure. I don't think the Kings thought so. And then when you look at the Phoenix, who's next to Xavier Cooks? Well, you have this 3-level scorer in Matt Hurt. So the balance probably fits the Phoenix better than what it would have with the Sydney Kings. But then in hindsight, you look at it, I immediately point to the Illawarra Hawks. And they are winning basketball games consistently and looking outstanding with Mason Peeling and Sam Froling on the floor. Mason Peeling's not a non-shooter, but he's not some guy. He's not like a Jack McVay level guy who's going to stretch the floor at all times. He's someone who does play like inside out. And so you've got 2 inside presences, basically 2 post presences almost, working together. There's a way in the NBL, because of how shrunken the floor is, you can maybe make it work just by having a lot of size. And maybe that's something that teams rethink. Teams went away from size this season. But when you look at the Illawarra Hawks, Mason Peeling, Sam Froling, you don't think Xavier Cooks and Geordie Hunter could work? If that can work, that can work. So I think that could be a new style of thinking, but I think everyone just wants spacing. That's what it is. And if you have Xavier Cooks and Geordie Hunter, you probably don't have that.
Yeah, the money stuff is fair enough as well. So when I say, you would love to see him still there for the roster balance, maybe it's something that actually wasn't possible, but it was certainly something I was thinking of moving forward, because I do think the way teams put their local guys together, then build the imports around it. Tassie, I think, are a team that's going to have a look at it. Adelaide, who knows what they look like next year, probably an entire new roster, and go down the list. It is interesting. And the Kings, just in the past, if you think about the title teams that they had, obviously they had Jalen Adams, but they also had Ian Clark there. Then DJ Vasiljevic was always there. Yeah, Derek Walton that was there the second time they go win the title. So they always had 2 or 3 guards that were real threats. And I do think if you've got multiple guys in the perimeter that can create and are a threat from the perimeter, plus you actually have 2 big men, Xavier Cooks a little more so than Geordie Hunter, but Geordie Hunter can facilitate. We've seen him have some beautiful passes out of pick and roll situations under the basket, finding Duncan spot, kicking it out to perimeter. So I think they're a little more creative. They're not your typical 2 big men. And to your point, I actually think they're more facilitators and creative with the ball as on offense, in the half-court offense, than that pair from Illawarra.
Yeah, the two, and I know we're off on this tangent, but it's fun. The 2 championships that the Sydney Kings won, they're big men. It was Xavier Cooks, and it was Jarrell Martin, and it was Tim Suarez. So again, these are 2 guys who would stretch the floor. So I think when you look at it, all right, this is the mold of the team that we have, the type of big we put next to Xavier Cooks to maximize everybody. Cam Oliver fit more of those little bits of skill sets than someone like Geordie Hunter or any local big, any traditional big would have fit. So again, I get the idea of putting this guy who could theoretically stretch it next to Xavier Cooks. The problem became when they started the season and they played, Cam Oliver was the backup 5, but he wouldn't play next to Xavier Cooks. And they're only doing that more and more recently. So there'll be conversations on, all right, what in this team is working, what's not working, what parts do we have to alter a little bit. Again, there is the core of a team that should be really, really good. They have to be way better offensively. But yeah, there's a core of a team there. They need to make a lot of tweaks in the offseason. But again, we've spoken about it. Whoever makes the 4 could just go and win it because of how open this league is. So now, if they go and win it, do you just run it back? I don't think I wouldn't, but it's so open that you don't question anything right now, not until the team's completely knocked out.
That's the thing. I don't remember an NBL season. Certainly, we've been doing this pod for 4 or 5 years now, and I don't really remember a season where I felt like there were so many question marks about the champions. So, to be honest, unless it's Illawarra, because Melbourne went through that really bad 2-month stretch, really. So, if anyone else wins the title aside from Illawarra, you're going to be looking at a champion that in stretches through the season or perhaps throughout the whole entire season looked incredibly flawed, which makes it so fascinating. And even though you can look at the negatives, there are moments or quarters where that Sydney Kings team looks competent. Another note I had from Melbourne United, and I thought it was a highly unimpressive win over Tasmania. I think in the end, the talent just allowed them to overwhelm Tasmania. Shea Lee had some great plays late in this game, and they were able to win. But the one question I had out of this game, because I don't think there's too much to take, Tassie, unfortunately, we know they're decimated. And even in this game, they got some of their guys back and just missed some opportunities. I think Fab Krislovich missed about 5 layups. Majuk Dang blew a tire on one of them and just wasn't like that. They still probably should have been in a better position. The question I've got is Ian Clark. We spoke about him a couple of weeks ago. Where is he at? And where is this Melbourne team at offensively? And again, we're talking about beating the absolute best teams because they've come up short offensively and defensively against some of these best teams over the last 2 or 3 months. But then he had 2 games against Brisbane where he had 24 points. He had 16 points against Perth. But in the 7 games around that, including the one on the weekend, he hasn't topped 12 points once. And in 5 of those 7 games, he's been in single-digit scoring. And my question is Ian Clark going to be the difference between this Melbourne United team winning the title or not? Because all of a sudden, this offense, the depth of the rotation, how damaging they look, particularly in moments where Chris Goulding is off the floor, because that's often when Ian Clark is able to take over the offense. If he's not playing to that style level, this Melbourne team feels like they are short on that end of the floor to me.
Yeah, and I guess the flip side to that is Chris Goulding had 10 points in that game against Tassie. Now, I think we all agree Tassie should have won that game. It is very unfortunate that they didn't, because it would have made for more drama in this final week. It would have been they won against Cairns and Adelaide lost to Perth, and Taz is in there, Adelaide's not. But they lost the game. There's no realistic chance for Tassie to make the 6. But yeah, on Melbourne United, they need Ian Clark to at least find a consistent level of scoring or creation to give something, because relying so heavily on Chris Goulding to give you 18 plus points a game, and he has the capacity to do that, right? His shot making is still out of this world, but they need someone to come with him, because I don't think there's a consistent level of output from Shea Ili or Matthew Dellavedova. And because they're not getting it from really anyone else, Jack White can give you a game every 3 or 4 maybe. But they don't have like that JLA type. They don't have that target at the big spot or at any of the big spots, right? And so everyone's a complementary player. So they do need someone to step up and be a little bit more than that. Shea Ili can do that in stretches. I thought he did that against Tassie. He's trying to do that more and more this season, where he gets his head on the rim. He's playing downhill. They're pushing the ball a lot, which I think is maybe a sign that they don't completely trust what they do in the half court offensively.
That's right, my notes.
The ball and get whatever they can in transition.
Particularly against the Tassie team, and you can carry on, but that was the first note I had in that first quarter. I was like, why is Melbourne playing so fast? This is not typically the way things go down. I know this is a strong Tasmania defense, but that was exactly the note I had. Are they really concerned about what they're generating in the half court right now? And I think it's true. I actually thought the best stretch of offense in terms of running sets, running offense, and he's been a guy that I've questioned in the depth, was when Kyle Boland was a feature of the offense in the third quarter, and they were running sets. They were getting to the ball to him and around the free throw line, and he was able to create a little bit. He was able to knock down that little push shot that he's got a few times in a row, and that was actually one of their better stretches of offense. But then they went straight back to just jacking up threes. Rob Lowe takes some terrible shots sometimes in transition that are hard to believe, and they sort of get out of rhythm and just try and quickly score. And I think you're right. I think it's because they are a little bit concerned about their ability in the half court.
Yeah, and there's just like a significant reliance on Shea Ili and Matthew Dellavedova. They're their 2-point guards. They're the ones who are tasked with running the show. And we saw against, I think, the Perth Wildcats last week or 2 weeks ago, where Delhi in the crunch was the ultimate floor general. And when you have Chris Goulding flying off screens and you have those bigs slipping to the basket, he's able to control the pace really well, and he's able to find guys. But in the general, flow of an offense throughout the entire game, it's just tough to see them finding consistent scoring unless Chris Goulding is going nuclear, or unless Ian Clark is doing something. And that's Ian Clark coming off handoffs and coming off turnouts and putting heat on the rim and shooting the ball at a high level. That's been up and down. So unless he's doing that, again, the trust factor with this team is very tough. You trust what they do defensively, and they fixed a lot of that toward the back end of this season. But again, offensively, this is one of those, it's a really weird season where there are a lot of good defensive teams who just get outscored. And I don't think we've seen that a lot in the past, where just offense is king. We haven't seen a lot of that. This season, we're seeing it more and more. Whether we see it in the playoffs is a different story, right? Generally, if your defense holds up, you perform well in the playoffs. But this season, we've seen too many times where offense is king. Offense is the thing that has getting teams over the line. Come the playoffs, I don't know. But that's got to be somewhat concerning for Melbourne, just the inconsistencies on that end.
A little bit. Melbourne, as much as you bring up the Ian Clark stuff, I still feel more confident in them than teams outside that top 2 right now, bar maybe Perth, who we'll get to in just a little bit. Because Melbourne...
When we talk about players I trust or people I trust, Ian Clark is in that box. He's in the box as come the playoffs. I trust the ball in his hands.
That's what I'm saying. That's why at the game against Tassie, I was like, that's interesting, because after you watched the 2 games previously, I was just like, all right, we raised it. It was an extended stretch where he was struggling, but he's like, it's a business end. I'm Ian Clark. Now I'm going to show up. So that's why the game against Tassie was a little interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if he takes over the game against Southeast Melbourne, and we feel pretty good about this Melbourne team heading into the postseason. But yeah, it was a highly unimpressive game right across the board. And to your point about the half-court stuff and what Daly can do, they really need Jack White. They were talking about the back issue. I know he's had some issues with that through the season. He didn't play a lot in this game, and that opens up the pick and roll. That opens up the lob game a lot. Like, Jack White is a massive, massive piece of this offense.
And he's had a leg issue or a foot issue.
Was it?
I think a knee issue throughout the season too. So he's got to mend just generally as a human being. Because again, it was effectively they replaced Luke Travis with Jack White and Joe Luala Jr. with nobody, with two guys, with Rob Lowe and Marcus Lee. So they need some sort of production from the big spots, from the forward spots, from the front court. And unless Jack White's doing that, again, Carbone was great in this game. He got to his spots in that first half. He's not on my trust list yet. He's not someone who I'm trusting to give me a ton of offensive production. He's not that guy yet. So yeah, they need all these things to click. I don't know if they do that. Again, defensively, they're cool. But yeah, Jack White, he needs to be a 15-plus points a game guy from this point onwards.
So the reason why I raised Perth a little bit before is because we've been tracking this for the last 3 or 4 weeks, starting Aquera, starting Almansa, and, asking the question, how long is this going to last? And we have seen by the way that John really has used his closing rotation that he would go back to Pinder. He would go to Wagstaff at times over those young guys. But I thought it was ultimately an incredible rotation move by Really, because I think that he engaged these young guys. They were able to provide really good energy and effort, and they'd fly around up and down, play transition basketball, which sometimes hasn't always been the case for this Perth Wildcats team. But now we get to crunch time, and Pinder's back in the starting lineup, and he's starting to look like he's playing better basketball. You get Dylan Windler, he comes straight back into the starting lineup. It was only an eye injury, so it made sense that he was going to be fresh and ready to go. Ty Webster now is in that offensive role off the bench. And surprise, surprise, like same for every team. You take out 2 key players, but then you also insert the guy that is supposed to really be your second best player back in the starting lineup. And all of a sudden you look at this Perth team and you go, damn, this team is deep, and they can run an eight-guy rotation that is really, really talented right across the board, whether it's you want defensive energy, now you want to go all-out offense. Now you got Doolittle, who is playing better offensive basketball than I didn't even know he was capable of this based on what we saw last year and early this season. All of a sudden, Perth does look like a powerful team. The challenge with all these clubs, like we've spoke before, the Wildcats threw up that effort against Cairns. Now, I said I'm okay to give them a mulligan. Outside of that, it's been probably 2 months of the Perth Wildcats looking good, and I just thought it was interesting that really pulled that trigger of getting Pinder back in the starting lineup now, just right on the eve of the postseason.
Well, especially because David Aquera played 5 minutes in that game against Sydney.
And his minutes, these minutes haven't been big. They've been around at like 10 to 15, 16, 17, and he's been going to Pinder in crunch time. But to now say, okay, the young guys are ready. We know that, they could potentially be required, but we're just going with our best guys.
Yeah, I don't know how much trust there'll be in a guy like David Aquera or Ethan Almansa in a playoff series. It's very tough to see those guys playing considerable minutes, over 10 minutes a game in a playoff series. But to your point, the fact that they haven't just been sitting on the pine the whole season, I guess that's helpful. Pinder, maybe it's just getting Pinder back to a level of confidence that was required to then start him and then be okay with that. Like him against the Southeast Melbourne Phoenix, it was like a reminder, and I've said this for years, he's the most athletic player in the league, and he just has to know that. As long as he plays like he knows he is more athletic than you, then he will be an effective basketball player. There's no one twitchier in the NBL than Keanu Pinder. His ability to move side to side, he's so dynamic. He's unbelievably athletic, where guys can't stay in front of him because he moves so quickly from side to side. But that he plays with such an impressive level of athleticism that I'm just surprised he hasn't been able to be more effective over the course of a whole season from a consistency standpoint. Now, he had 12 and 10 in that game against Sydney. They got production from a lot of guys. They had 6 guys in double figures. Now, is Pinder their starter going forward now? Do you lean into this? Do you give him the confidence that, all right, you're our guy now? Because I feel like whatever mind tricks JR was potentially playing, I feel like you've got to just stop doing that now and lean into continuity as you get to this back end. Because when you look at their starting lineup of Henschel, Cotton, Windler, Doolittle, Pinder, not many teams compete with that from a scoring standpoint, from a potential defensive standpoint. They're not an outstanding defensive team. There's not much resistance in the backcourt, but there are signs where they could be okay. And just from a size standpoint, everyone outside of Bryce Cotton is freaking huge. There is a ton of size and length there, so you can trust that team. I thought they leaned into Keanu Pinder a little bit earlier, and look, I don't know if Aquera really gets minutes in a playoff series, but I get the idea of sort of like breeding them, sort of grooming them for the moment. We'll see if it matters. But yeah, Pinder finding his feet is unbelievably important to this team.
Yeah, but it worked. And that's the thing. By playing those young guys, because the defensive minutes were really good, and they just brought an energy at the start of the game that isn't always there with Pinder. So I don't know whether Pinder was fully healthy as well. We know he's been banged up, a lot really over the last few years. So was he fully healthy as well? But I also thought it was smart that, even if Pinder wasn't starting, he was still closing games. So he knew, and I don't know what John really was saying to him, but he was like, all right, well, we're starting these young guys. They're providing good energy. You're going to close the game. You're in our best starting five. And now we get to this point in time, so he comes in to start. You can't take him out now. Like, he will start for the rest of the season. And we've said the whole year, the Perth Wildcats need the best, aggressive, energetic Keanu Pinder if they're going to win games. And that was why last week I brought it up when they lost to Cairns, and there was like 3 moments, like Pinder, he had an offensive foul. He fouled defensively on a 3-point shot. But I was like, I kind of think it's okay, because the alternate version of Keanu Pinder is when he's not engaged. He's not trying to make those hustle plays. He's not being a physical force. So no, it didn't work out. Yes, Perth lost the game. You would have liked to win it, particularly because of how tight the race is. But I still think getting that version of Pinder, who looks highly invested, is better for your chances of winning the title, even if you drop that one game and things didn't work out. And we saw it carry over again this week. So I like what we've seen. He's got. I've said it all year. He's got to be a star level player for this team to win.
I think it's helpful now that Christian Doolittle is, I think, clearly their second best player. I think that helps the situation a lot, because the pressure on Keanu Pinder is eased just a tiny bit, because we know what Christian Doolittle is now as an offensive hub, and then obviously defensively, how versatile he is and how effective he is. Doolittle being that, I think, takes a bit of pressure off Keanu Pinder, sort of lets him just be himself. And we saw in this game, again, it was 12-10, but like those 5-0 boards were extremely important. It seemed like when Keanu Pinder got to the line, that felt important. It felt like he was stopping a Kings run. So he was able to interject himself in stretches. He didn't have to be the second star. Maybe it's okay if he's just the third star on this team, because Christian Doolittle has sort of elevated himself into that. Honestly, I feel like it's not a hierarchy, but I think it takes the pressure off Keanu Pinder from like a production standpoint, where he can go get, what do you have? He had 12, 10, and 3. And that's okay, because I think the impact was clearly there.
This week, Adelaide comes to Perth. I like the challenge, because you're going to go up against a guy that's as intense as anyone in the league in Montrezl Harrell. So offensively, I'm looking forward to that matchup. And we are running out of time here. I think the boys have got a live Super Bowl show from New Orleans coming up here in about 10 minutes. So we're about to get kicked off the platform. But I mentioned Montrezl Harrell, and I just want to bring this up. Because, yes, he was the reason that they got back in this game against Southeast Melbourne. There was a stretch where it was like, just give Montrez the ball and he's going to dominate. He's either going to score or he's going to facilitate. He completely took over this game. But he was also the reason why they were down by 20 points, because he was terrible in the first half. And in the first 50 seconds of this game, he was bullied by Matt Hurt to the basket. Then he contested on a 3-point shot and tried to cherry pick. They gave up an offensive rebound. Harrell finally got under the basket and then fouled Geordie Hunter on an N1. All this happened in the first 52 seconds. Then he's on the bench, and I don't know what was said, first of all. If anyone crossed the line, fine. He's got the right to go back at fans, but he's completely distracted there. He's just moping up and down the floor. He's going to be the best player. This is why you got to be frustrated if you're an Adelaide fan. And I know Adelaide fans get stuck into you, Olgun, and they say something nice about this team. Why are you always anti-Adelaide? I can't believe that Adelaide fans aren't more negative about their own team based on what they've seen this season. Like, they're going to make the top 6. And I said last week they could be my second seed. Like, I think they can go through and win the whole damn thing. But there's no way that you can watch this team's roller coaster all season long. Kendrick Davis is again arguing with coaches on the bench. You can't be a fan of this team and also defend what's happened. Like, they're going to finish the regular season below 500. It's incredible to me. Like, I don't know how they continue to be defended.
Yeah, so firstly, it's not about me, but I wrote an entire column last week on Adelaide's defense shifting in a really positive way, and I still got hate for it because he wrote it because he felt pressure to write something nice about Adelaide. So I can't win, right? Those were just like objective numbers too. And everyone has to understand
what I'm saying is the Adelaide 36ers as a club are very, very lucky that their fans are this loyal. Because there aren't that many teams that would have fans as loyal as these guys. So I'm giving these fans credit. I'm saying I don't understand why you're so loyal, but you are as loyal as any in the league.
Yeah. People also have to understand that when we talk about these teams, we don't do it just from like what we see on the basketball court. There is intel that surrounds all this stuff. So that's important to understand. When it comes to Montrezl Harrell, he's been largely a net negative defender all season long. And I understand the offense is the thing that everyone notices because it's exciting, right? That's the numbers. But defensively, again, we've said it all season. They're the worst defensive team in the top 6, and that's been clear as day. They got better toward the end of the season, but these last 2 games were not helpful. They didn't look very good. I didn't think Kendrick Davis looked I thought he looked real bad in that first game against Brisbane. They have no resistance up front. They have no resistance in the back line outside of Isaac Humphries, and Montrezl Harrell has been an issue on that end, because he comes out and he seemingly treats everyone with a level of contempt, and then Torrey Smith-Milner hits 4 threes on him because he doesn't carry a hand. He doesn't close out the 3-point shooter. Like, you have to play with the requisite level of seriousness when it comes to these moments. And again, that game against the Southeast Melbourne Phoenix was the same. You have to play with that level of seriousness because you know Josh King has his guys playing with that. You can't act like you're the NBA player who's better than everybody because you're not the best player in this league. And I think everyone has to understand that. And realize that there are high-level players in this league who will go at you and be better than you on any given night because this is FIBA basketball and you have to play like the possessions matter. This is something that we've had conversations about throughout the entire season with this Adelaide team. They play like an NBA team. You can't do that in this league. You have to play like the possessions matter because they do matter. And we're seeing that now where teams aren't going to make it because of percentage, or teams are going to be knocked out of a 3rd or 4th seed because of percentage. Every possession matters. These guys have to play like that. Over the past 2 games, it looks like they haven't cared, unfortunately. And that sucks to see because everyone's pointing to them as this really talented team who can go and beat anybody. But do you really trust them to go and beat a team when it comes to a very meaningful situation? Do you trust this team to care? I don't know if they've showed enough for me to think that they're going to care when it comes to those moments.
I can't sit here and change what I said 7 days ago. So I'm going to have to live with the fact that...
Yes, you can.
No.
You can change your opinion based on your evidence. It's so easy.
No, it's frustrating because I thought that, I got sucked in and I thought that they were showing me something after questioning them all season long. I finally caved and I was like, you know what? I think this team can lock in. All I'm asking for is 4 weeks. That's all, not even 4 weeks. That's all they need to do. I was like, they can do that. And they provided 2 of the worst performances we've seen from them all season, and that's saying something. So, look, you got Perth Wildcats this week. You might play this team again in a couple of weeks' time. I know they're going to be in the top 6, and they're probably going to be on the road for that first game. It might be against Sydney next week. But just treat this like a postseason game. Like, you can't walk out there, walk up and down the court, be lazy on defense, show no interest basically in playing a game of basketball when everything is on the line. So Adelaide, this week, please. I think you could be the 2 seed. I just need you to just show some effort from the start of this game against Perth. Your fans deserve it. Show as much effort as your fans do defending you online. Like, that's all I'm saying. Come on, 36ers. Just lock in for a month.
I agree. The loss to the Bullets was really bad. It was one of the worst losses, maybe the worst loss of the season. Really, really poor showing from that team. And credit to Brisbane, playing with 6 dudes and then coming away with that win, locking in defensively when they have been great defensively all season. Credit to Brisbane for that, but that was Adelaide dropping a game and showing all the warts that we had seen over the course of the season. They showed them in these 2 games, and it took a Jason Kadeem masterclass to not allow that Phoenix game to be a blowout. Because if that was a blowout, then maybe we're talking about Tassie maybe making the 6. So, man, credit to Jason Kadeem for maybe keeping that season alive. But if you're relying on Jason Kadeem to keep your season alive, then I don't know how much longer your season is going to be living for.
And yes, Kadee was great. And as I mentioned from the start, when I started that, I mean, that was just about the most unstoppable stretch of big man basketball we've seen. What Montrez did down the stretch, it didn't result in a win. But, offensively, he could not be stopped. And that's what I said. You got Montrezl Harrell, you got Keanu Pinder this week, Doolittle's in there, a bunch of star big-ish men that I think is going to be fascinating to watch this week. Let's wrap it up. We're about to get kicked off. So, Olgun, you'll be with us on Thursday night on Nothing But Net Aussie Hoops, and I believe DJ Vasiljevic is going to be there as well. So that might be good timing to talk about the Adelaide 36ers, what went down last weekend, what we're going to see this weekend. So if you're a 36ers fan, tune in and see what DJ has to say. You got anything cooking before we leave, mate, on espn.com.au?
Oh, yeah. There's a Boomers versus New Zealand series that will be happening in May. That's something that'll be announced at some point today. Australian Boomers and the New Zealand Tall Blacks, and also the Opals and Tall Ferns. They will be playing exhibition games in the Sunshine Coast, in Adelaide, in Hamilton, in New Zealand. That'll be announced today. That'll be Australia and New Zealand never play each other anymore in senior national basketball. So this will be an opportunity to see those teams play each other in exhibition games. So that's very exciting. That'll be announced at some point today. And then just general free agency sort of tricklings that come out. You'll see all that stuff. That's basically it from me. What about you?
No, just about to go do Nothing But Net. We've got 5 shows this week. Next week, head to San Francisco for All-Star Weekend. So lots going on. And Sunday, Sunday I'll probably just sit at home and watch the Super Bowl and watch our guys over there do great work covering that game as well. So it's going to be a good Monday in Australia, Sunday over here in the US, and trade deadline. Of course, we have got Nothing But Net NBA pregame about 2 hours after the trade deadline on Thursday or Friday morning for Australia. So it's going to be fascinating. I think we're going to have I think there's going to be some stuff go down over the next few days, which is going to be a lot of fun. But keep it locked on espn.com.au. Keep tracking everything that Olgun's bringing to the table. And we'll see you all next week when we know who is playing in the playing games and maybe where those playing games are going to be. We'll see you all next week.